G'day, Keithy here. Thank you for tuning in. If you're new and you want to lift your P38 Range Rover by 2 inches, then there's a video up there. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to show you what I've done to the height sensors in order to be able to use the full advantage of the 2-inch spacers long travel shocks for a 2-inch lift for the P38 Range Rover. So what I'm going to show you now is all of the tools you need, all of the gear you need to do these height sensor adjustments. And then afterwards you may need to tune it a little bit, but hopefully not if you get this right. This is how I've done it. You might feel that there's a different way you can do it to achieve the same result. But anyway, this is sort of a DIY guide to how I've done it if you want to try and follow suit. Okay, so I've got everything up on this bench here, my workbench, that you'll need to lift. There will extend the height sensors on a P38. Very important tool up the top there, a glass of water. Make sure you stay hydrated. It's very hot here at the moment. I don't know how hot it is for you. We'll start with the tools you'll need. When you're cutting a thread, you need some kind of thread lube. I don't have any thread lube left, so I'm using, that's just the old trusty CRC. You can use WD-40 or whatever. We're not going to be cutting extreme threads in anything, but that will definitely help when you're cutting. You're going to need some drills. You're going to need an angle grinder or a hacksaw. My hacksaw just packed it in, so I've got a very thin cutting disc on my angle grinder. You're going to need a drill and obviously a battery if you're running 18-volt gear like I am with this Ryobi gear. And also it will help if you have a vise. You don't have to have a vise. I previously didn't have one, but it'll make the job a little bit easier. That's not bolted down. We're not doing anything too hardcore, so that's not too bad. And another big thing is the little ruler. You can use a tape measure, you can use a longer ruler if you want. I just chose to use the little one. So I've split this up into 2 sections. So you got the rear stuff there and the front stuff here. For the rears, obviously you need your height sensors, don't you? With the height sensors, we're not worrying about this top arm on the sensor. We're only worried about this one here. This is the one we're going to modify. So here's one I removed earlier. That's what the lower arm looks like when it's removed from the upper arm. I'll show you how to remove them in a minute. For the rear, you're going to need thread locker. The way that I've done it, you're going to need 8 6mm M6 nuts. You're going to need 4 connecting nuts, M6. And you're also going to need a die to tap a thread onto this bottom arm once you've cut it. These are relatively cheap to buy, just like this. I have an actual kit up here among all my other cool tools. But the 6mm, funny enough, in my kit is a bit dodgy, so I went and got a new one for this. It's only cost me about, I think, $10 Australian for that. That's the rear sorted there. Let's move over to the front. The front, we're doing it a bit differently now. If you'll notice here on the lower arm of this particular front height sensor, there's not a lot of meat on there. So unlike the rears, where we can just cut it and tap a thread and do the connecting nut and bolt trick, can't do that on the fronts because there's not a lot of meat. So what we're going to need to do is cut some of this rubber off here to allow more of the length on that little shaft there. And we're going to use these bolts. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to cut the nut off the top. We're going to cut the thread off the bottom because we don't need that much. Now, if you've watched my other video, you'll know that I extended my front height sensors by 23mm in the front. And in the rear, I extended them by 48mm. Now, that doesn't have to be exactly perfect there because you've got a bit of calibration room on a P38. So say we were to do 45 here and 25 there, that's okay. That'll get you through without drama. So what I'm going to go through now, we also need some thread locker, sorry, my bad. And I've got a couple of split pins here. And this is where the drill bits come in handy. So we're going to cut these 2 nuts so that we've got this little shaft here. How much do we want to increase the height of this sensor by? 23mm. Well, let's just call it 25 as a round number. So what we need to do is we need to drill into the top of this once we've cut it, approximately 10mm. So once we've exposed a little bit of the shaft there, we'll have a little bit of breathing room. We'll drill into the top, drill into the bottom, 10mm each, and then the rest of it will be measured up with the length of this particular shaft. So 10 at the top, 10 at the bottom is 20, and we want to go 25, so that's a total of 35mm shaft length that we're going to need. If you stuff up, at least you've got this here you can use as well, because this particular bolt that I bought, you can see, is very close to 35mm. Actually, right there up to the shaft is 35mm. So if for some reason I screwed this up, I can always use the bottom part here. May look a little bit agricultural, but it'll do the job still. So as with the rear, guys, we're only focused on the lower arm for these front height sensors. We don't want the top arm modified whatsoever. So it's only the lower one, 25 roughly, lower arm, 45 roughly. The rest can be calibrated. The main thing when you're doing this is that both sensors, because there are 2 sensors on the rear and 2 sensors on the front, they need to end up the same length. So if they're unequal, you're going to have some calibration issues. You want to make sure that the final product, once you've extended these arms, is the same length. First thing you need to do is you need to measure from the center to the end. So as we've done there, from the center to roughly the center of this bolt here, what have we got there? About 127 millimeters. If you want to go inches, I'm not really good with all that kind of inchy stuff, but that's pretty close to 5 inches on the dot actually. Pretty well perfect at 5 inches. So you can do the math on that. If we're going to extend this one by 45 millimeters, well, you would say 50 millimeters is 2 inches. So it's just shy of 2 inches. So 12.7 millimeters, centimeters. We're going to need to take that up by 45. So that's going to take us to 17.225 roughly as a final product. It's longer than this ruler. I'll get a bigger ruler for that once it's finished. And these ones here, 23, so obviously 10 in, 10 in, and that was where the little sections of this height sensor will go in. And then 25 in between, so 35 mil, 45 mil, sorry. All up, my maths was a little bit dodgy there. And then once they're in and they've set with the epoxy, chemi-weld, whatever you want to use, we're going to drill through the side, including the side of this, and put split pins through there, just as another securing mechanism. Never be too sure. That's how I've done it on this, and they have done a lot of Ks on 2 vehicles, this lift kit. I originally had this on my blue Range Rover, and now it's on this big rig here. So this is exactly as I've done it on my other Range Rover. For the rear sensors, you'll also need some booker rod. This is 6mm booker rod. See, if you don't know what booker rod is, this is very hard to get focus here. It's just a threaded rod, guys. Very hard to focus on that. Threaded rod, M6. You can get it anywhere. I think it costs $3 or $2 or something. Everything you see up here parts-wise, excluding the height sensors. So all of the die, the thread locker, and all of this other jazz here that I had to purchase for this cost me about $50. Just over 50, let's say 55. So that's the Mods 2 height sensors for $50. Alrighty, so what I like to do when I'm taking these arms off this height sensor, I've got a vise. You don't need a vise, you can do it without. Makes it easier. If you don't have one, that's okay. Bit of CRC, just a tiny bit in the back and in the front. Don't need much. Give it a little swivel around, free it up basically. These things have been on a vehicle that's probably been through mud and dust and whatnot. If it hasn't, then you're lucky. But if it has, this just makes it a little bit easier to get them off. I just do this because I like to make life easy. Small screwdriver, that's all you need. Don't need to go crazy. You got to get it in there underneath the rubber in here. Now be gentle, you don't want to break this rubber while you're doing this job. Just wiggle it in nice and gently. If it's a bit hard to get in, because this rubber can harden obviously with time, then you can use a smaller one. I've just got to tighten the vise up a little bit, that would help. Don't want to squash the height sensors, but you don't want to have it moving while you try to do this either. Okay, so I'm getting it under there pretty good now. The way that I've found reasonably easy to get these off is to move the screwdriver with the sensor at the same time and push with your thumb on the other side. If you can't do that, that's okay. Just twist and pull like this with the screwdriver in there, and they come off reasonably easy. You don't have to go doing any voodoo magic to get these off. Trying to do it while filming is a little bit difficult sometimes. I'll turn it a bit side on just to make it a bit easier for myself. Oh, dropped my screwdriver. That's never good. Guide him off a little bit. Just prise him gently, gently. We don't want to break it. It's good. It's coming off nicely there. It's mostly off there at the front, and you just wiggle, wiggle, wiggle until it completely comes off. There you go, pretty easy there. Made that look difficult, didn't I? It's not very difficult once you get the lip on the front part just over this little edge here. It comes off pretty easy, just with a few little wiggles back and forwards. This is what you'll be left with once you've removed your lower arms for the height sensors from the actual sensor themselves, from the secondary or upper arms. For now, we're not going to worry about the rears. We're going to worry about the fronts. This is what we're on to. First thing you need to do, and you don't have to have this bolt in here, I just left these in here. We need to trim some of this rubber off these front arms. So what we'll do is we'll measure up this exposed thread, which is 20 mils. We know that when we cut this, we're going to lose a little bit of that meat. So we're going to take maybe 5 to 7 millimeters, so only that much, off these arms. Let's say 7 millimeters. You can use a Stanley knife, you can use a, what kind of kitchen knife, whatever you've got laying around to get this off. The main thing is that you don't want to take too much of this meat off here, because this little rod actually attaches to the rubber here. It's congealed just up the top here. So if you take too much off, the rod's going to fall out. You're not going to have any rod left. So you want to take as little off as you have to in order to give yourself some more length on this little shaft here. So I'm going to take 7 millimeters off both of these ends here, and I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so once you've taken your 5 mils of rubber roughly off each of these ends here, as you can see, I've done the same on both of these. Should be left with a shaft of about, 35-ish mils. That's 35, that one. And that one's 35 as well. I've just cleaned it up, given it a little bit of a file just to get off any little bits of burr that were on there. The next step we're going to do is we've got to cut these in half. Use your hacksaw or something as thin as you can. The thinnest thing you can use to cut them in half is good, because obviously we don't have much of the shaft here to use, so we don't want to shorten it by too much. Before you cut anything, make sure you measure center to center on each of the height sensors. So front one's 80 mil. Let's just confirm that with this one here. Yep, 80 mil. Sorry about the camera angle there. 80 millimeters. So that's a starting reference point for a standard height sensor. So we're going to increase it by 25, so that's 105 we're going to end up with on the front height sensors. Let's get into it. I'll cut them in half and show you what they look like. Okay, so once they're cut, this is what you'll be left with. Not too crazy there. Before you go cutting and drilling your bolt here, you want to measure your length again, so you can put your two bits together. I know that I used the 1 mil angle grinder blade disc to cut this. I've measured it up and it's 79 millimeters. Both of those are 79 millimeters, so you've only lost a millimeter. Now what we need to do is we worked out that we're going to drill 10 millimeters into the top of our bolt and 10 millimeters into the bottom of the bolt, and we want to extend these sensors by about 25 millimeters. So 25 plus 20 makes 45. So I need to have a shank of this bolt at about 45 millimeters long. Alrighty, so here is what's left of our bolt. So that's the shank of the bolt, and they're approximately 45 millimeters. 45 millimeters, beautiful. Don't worry if you don't get that exactly perfect. The main thing is that they're pretty much the same length. If it's a millimeter out here or there, it's not going to affect things dramatically. You can always drill a millimeter further into the top to compensate for that. That's a precise thing. What I might mention too is, see how I've deburred the top of these? So I used an angle grinder to cut these. I don't know what you've got to use, but if you're going to use an angle grinder or anything for that matter, just make sure you deburr it when you finish so that you don't cut yourself. And it also looks a little bit better too. I mean, it's not professional by any means, but it's nicely deburred. Nobody's going to cut themselves on those. Now what I've got to do, these are still very hot, I've got to drill my holes into the top and the bottom. 10 millimeters is what we said, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to put them in the vise and use my drill bit. I'm going to do 2 stages. So I'm going to start off with a very small drill bit, and then I'm going to move up to the 6 mil drill bit, because we know that These shafts are 6mm in diameter. Always start with a little one. Go in 10mm. So what you can do is you can wrap a little bit of tape around 10mm up on the drill bit there, and that'll tell you when to stop drilling. Then you've made your 10mm. It's very simple. Otherwise, you can paint them, or there's a lot of options to get your measurement there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap a little bit of tape around the top of both of these at the 10mm mark, so that I know how far in I need to drill. Okay, so what you see here is what it looks like once the holes have been drilled in the top of your shank. Not much left of that bolt now, is there? It doesn't have to be perfectly centered, but ideally it would be. Now what happens is these fit into those holes. The final product is right here, so that's what it will look like in the end. I haven't put epoxy in that yet. Remember, we started off with 80mm. Now we are at 103. 103mm in the center, which is exactly the same as I have on that, believe it or not. So what's left to do now, I'll pull these out, I'll mix up this epoxy, put it in there and let it set. Once it's set, I will drill holes through the side, and I'll put our little circlips through. I'll probably only use 1/2 of that and bend it around. I don't want a big hole to go through there. I don't need a big hole, so I'll just put a small hole through the side, and these guys can go through. And that is one lower arm done. Okay, and there you have it. I've put the epoxy in. There's the epoxy, and I tell you what, that sets in less than a minute. That is pretty hardcore stuff. So that is in there. It reckons that it needs a curing time of 24 hours, but it should be set in 4 minutes. And I tell you what, yeah, I had to rush to get them in there. I've measured them up once I pushed them in, because you can't have too much error in this. And you see from center to center, which is about there, we get about 10.3 there. And on this one here, where are we? There's the center. 10.3 on that one as well. So that is perfect. That is a 23mm length extension to that height sensor. Once that's cured, I'll drill through and put the split pins through that. Now we need to move on to the rear sensors. What I'm going to do here, you can see I've just cleaned a little bit of the shit off there with the grinder. I've got to cut them in half now, but we'll measure the length first, cut them in half, and then we've got to extend them by about 48mm. So let's hope to get 48. We can get this one pretty accurate, and I'll show you what we've got to do. Alright, so I've got the rear height sensor cut in half. I've got my little die here. If you've never used one of these before, they're pretty easy to use. So you'll see inside here there's a little tapered section. That goes on first. You can't use that other side there first. Use the tapered section first. You sit it on. And we begin. Find it by hand. Remember, the way to do a nut up is lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, so you want to essentially use the righty-tighty theory. Get it beginning nice and steady, and then you can start to use your spanner to continue. So you might do, say, 3 turns forward, or 1 turn forward, half a turn back. 1 turn forward, half a turn back, until you've got as far down here as you want. In this case here, we probably only need to go down about 15 or 20 mils. I'll show you after I've done that one. G'day. As you can see, I've changed shirt because I always seem to wear white when I've got to do some work in the garage. So I've got the little die on here cutting the thread through the height sensor for the rear height sensor. It's a good idea to have a bit of lubrication as well. You don't need to get the special cutting compound. It's just essentially an oil really anyway. Once you've got it started, wind him on. This vise isn't bolted down, so I've got to do this by hand. So I've done about half a turn then, and you back off, go again, half a turn more. Using a proper tool would be the go. Half a turn, back off a little bit. That's where we were at. There we go, half a turn again. It is pretty hard to do. This vise isn't bolted down, so it makes it even harder. But it can be done with one hand. Half a turn, and then back. And that just clears it. So the reason that you go back is to clear it. So I've done about 2 turns then. Another little quick spray, you don't need too much. And you keep going, that's how you tap the thread onto this. Now I've done about just over 10 mil of thread on it so far. I'll go down about 25 millimeters and that'll be sufficient. I think we're going to put about 10 or 15 into the little connecting nut. So this bad boy is just going to screw on there like that. Lovely. So half of this connecting nut is going to be full of height sensor and the other half is going to be full of that booker rod, the 6mm booker rod that we've got. I'll keep going with these threads. If you've got any problems tapping threads yourself, check that your die is not just a no-name brand one. I had one of them previously when I tried to do this years ago when I made the kit, like 2012, and I couldn't get a thread started on these things. They're only 6mm, so all you need is an M6 thread, and once you've got it on there, it's really easy to do. Once you've tapped your thread, pick your die up, flip it over the other way and put it on, and that'll make sure that the thread is nice and clean. It's another good tip for when you're threading your height sensors. Okay, so I've threaded both ends of each of the rear height sensor arms. I cut 45mm of my booker rod here. This is the rod. So I cut 45mm of that. And what I've done is I've wound a connecting nut and a normal nut onto each end of the height sensor. Okay, there's your connecting nut, there's your normal nut. And then I've wound two nuts, onto the bit of 45mm rod that was cut out. I've threaded the rod into each of the connecting nuts, and then what we've got to do now is all we've got to do is tighten up these nuts upon the connecting nut at each end after I've put some thread sealer in there. So I've got some of that up here, bit of JB Weld, good gear that. So I put some JB Weld in there and I'll thread it all back together, Before I do a full tighten, I'll measure from the center of this to the center of that to make sure that I get my prescribed length. So what did we say it was? 48 mils. Even 45 would be okay. We can tune that out with the software for the suspension. So as long as I had about 45mm extra length in this rod, we're good. And the key thing is that they both need to match. So this one needs to be the same length as this one here. Keep that in mind when you're extending this. So if you extend that one by 47mm, you want to do this one by 47mm. All right, what I'm going to do now, I've already done this one here. So I put my thread sealer on there, and I've tightened them all up and I've measured it, and that is about 47 millimeters extra length in this one. 17, what was it? I can't remember the exact, 17 something centimeters. 17,250 or thereabouts. And this one here, yep, when I tighten it up, I'll make sure that the length is right, and it's easy to make it longer or shorter just simply by screwing that rod further in or taking it out a tiny bit from these connecting nuts before you do the final tighten of the nuts. And that is it, guys. That is how you extend the height sensors for a 2-inch lift on a P38 Range Rover. And this is the end result after everything's been tightened up. The epoxy set really nicely in there. I can't pull them apart. I did try. All that's left to do is to drill the holes in this and put the split pins through. So I'll knock that over tomorrow. But otherwise that is done. That is 2 extended height sensors, or 4 really. 2 for the back and 2 for the front, for when you lift your P38. Alright, so the epoxy has set completely in these front sensors. Fantastic. I've tried pulling that out. It's not going anywhere at all. Fantastic. So I've decided that I'm not going to put the split pins in those front height sensors. The rear ones are done. They're all nipped up. I've measured them again the next day, obviously, so that I can make sure that all the lengths are right, they're perfect. And what I ended up was with 47 extra millimeters on the rear sensors, and funny enough, 23 extra millimeters on the front ones. What that should mean is that I shouldn't need to calibrate this vehicle when I put the height sensors in for the 2-inch lift. Now this gentleman has got the 2-inch lift in his Range Rover. It's incomplete at the moment now. It's sitting at my mechanics, believe it or not, who is a Land Rover specialist. And lately I've been helping my mechanic with the suspension on this Range Rover. Initially I calibrated the heights with the standard bags, no suspension lift, just to give him a little bit more lift, a bit more height. Obviously there's only a limit that you can go to without modifying these height sensors. So I give him a little bit extra. He's got the big tyres, he's got 32-inch tyres on his P38. And then once the lift kit arrived, my mechanic fitted that up, and he's left the brains of the operation, the height sensors and the calibration, up to me. I generally give him a hand with things like that. If it's a technical thing, he doesn't have a lot of time to spend on these things to do tinkery stuff like that, calibrations and whatnot, whereas I've done it heaps of times. It doesn't take me long to get in and do. So it's quick and easy for him to ask me to come in, give him a hand, spend an hour or two here or there doing some calibrations. Now, because these are exactly the same as that, theoretically there shouldn't need to be any calibration done on that Range Rover that these are going into. But there will be, because I've already tuned the heights to be a little bit higher standard. Once I put these in, it's going to be essentially about 3 inches higher than standard. So I'm going to need to tune it down once I put those new sensors in, just to get the heights right. We've got baseline measurements from that vehicle when it was standard, and then after I lifted it with a calibration. Now he's got his long travel shocks in and the spacers and everything else needed for the lift as per that video. Should be good to go. So fit them in, a little bit of tuning. Should only take me about an hour to do it all up, including tuning the heights. And then old mate's going to have a 2-inch lifted P38 Range Rover. What I might also add, guys, if you're going to do these extended height sensors, there's a bit of a caveat here. Do not do that if you have standard air springs and no spacers, 2-inch spacers underneath your air springs, or even 1 inch at least. Because you will end up, when you are under complete compression, this will hit on your chassis rail in the rear with the longer sensors, because obviously you won't have longer bump stops. Your shock absorbers will have shorter travel, and what will happen is you'll end up breaking height sensors. So I'm going to be specific here just for everyone's awareness. Only extend your height sensors for suspension lift reasons if you have lifted your Range Rover. That is 2-inch spacers underneath your springs or on top in the front. You can do that that way. Long travel shocks, 2-inch spacers, all the other necessary items to do a 2-inch suspension lift. Make sure you've done them. Do not extend your height sensors unless you've done that. You'll break sensors, and what's likely to happen as well is you'll over travel your air springs as well when you flex up. Now the Arnott Gen 3 air springs have a tendency, when lifted right up high, to pop on that lower ring. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you're standard no lift and you just want to calibrate a lift into your P38 Range Rover at your highest height, you are likely to actually blow that crimp ring out at the bottom of the Gen 3 air spring. So it's advised not to lift it up any higher, because what happens is you've got these really tall springs and they're at your height, at your highest height, you're nearly at full extension already. So you've got a heap of air in there to keep the car just at its level. And then you go and flex, and what happens is it goes boom, there's so much pressure on it. As your tyre goes down, say you're in a rut or something like that, that it just blows the crimp rings out. So 2-inch suspension lift is necessary for that reason. If you want the height all the time for off-roading, and what that allows you to do is you can run in your standard height with a 2-inch suspension lift and have heaps of room left with that piston to bag. So you can still do the full travel thing without popping air springs. And that's the only problem with the Arnott Gen 3s. If you haven't done a 2-inch lift, they do have a tendency to do that. Arnott's have been pretty good replacing air springs that have popped on completely standard P38s, because in theory the product is designed for a completely standard P38 Range Rover, so there shouldn't be any issues with chucking a Gen 3 in a standard Range Rover and popping. If you've done some calibration or some long travel shocks or anything like that, say goodbye. They're not going to replace those springs for you as willingly as they would if your car was completely standard. So take care, guys. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Feel free to subscribe, do all that stuff that's down there. Really helps me keep these videos coming for you. I hope this has helped someone. If you're going to go and lift your Range Rover and you go, oh, I'm a bit scared of doing a height sensor mod, well, there you go. I've just sort of shown you how to do it, giving you an example, and nothing but ordinary household power tools did the job. And it took all of about 2 hours to do. Mind you, I was filming some parts while I did it, so it probably took me 3 or 4 hours all up. But very easy job. Don't be afraid to tackle it. If I get the chance, I will also show the installation of these height sensor arms into that particular Range Rover that I'm putting them in. And also I might even show you some calibration that I do if I get the chance. But if not, don't worry, there will be times. Take care guys, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.